I think our church should absolutely keep dreaming. I think that as long as there's still people to be reached, that we should continue to strive to do all that we can to reach those people.
There's never an end to it. There's always a need. There's always going to be a need. I think we have to reach as far as we can, keep dreaming as much as we can dream, because it's never going to stop.
We're going to keep dreaming.
We're going to keep dreaming.
We're going to keep dreaming.
We should always keep dreaming.
Hey, welcome back, everybody, and thank you for joining us for session 2 in our unfinished series and a study of the life of Abraham. And I want to just give a big shout out there to all of our hosts, wherever you are, wherever you're meeting. Thank you so much for investing in the spiritual growth of our people, but also joining me. Thank you for helping seed this information into the lives of people. Thank you for letting us pile in your home or wherever you may be meeting. And thank you to all of you for taking this journey with us. If you weren't here in week 1, you can go back to northplacechurch.com/unfinished and catch up. Read or follow along, watch the sermon from the weekend before, the small group from the weekend before. Let me just say this. I know a lot of times if you've been through small group studies, there's a little 5 to 7 minute video that gets you talking. This is a little more than that. I'm not equating myself to the Apostle Paul, but when Paul had a message for the church in Corinth, he wrote 1 Corinthians. It was a word in that season. And then he wrote another letter later, and it was 2 Corinthians. It was a word in that season. And I have a word for Northplace in this season that won't all fit on the weekends. And so my teaching is a little longer than the 5 to 7 minute small group sessions you might buy at a Christian bookstore. So bear with me as your pastor. I believe what I'm about to tell you is life transformational. Matter of fact, the one regret that I have is that as hard as I've pushed for all of our church to be a part of these small groups, I know people won't. And this material I want to share on the weekends, and it just wouldn't fit. But this is one of the most transformational messages I've ever prepared in my life. It's changed me, and I want to invite you on the journey. And I just want to say thank you in advance for being on the journey. Stay committed to it. Every weekend in church, every weekend in small groups, this whole thing is going to culminate on November the 10th when we combine all of our services together on a day of surrender in the Curtis Colwell Center. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be powerful. And if I have time, I'll remind you of that again before it's over. But mark that on your calendar. All services combined, November the 10th, 10:30 a.m., one massive service, a beautiful display of surrender of a people before God at the end of this journey through the life of Abraham. We've launched this church-wide initiative to expand the kingdom, to engage our surrounding communities like never before, and to equip the next generation to finish the unfinished task of covering this region and the world with the glory of God. And this whole journey is positioning us for that, because in order for us to be the people that God wants us to be and do the things that God wants us to do, He's got to transform us deeply in our hearts. And there's no better place, no better story in the Word, person in the Word, that models that deep transformation for us other than the life of Abraham. So last weekend, the previous weekend, in my sermon, and in the small group session, I talked about the call of God on every one of our lives to leave an eternal legacy. And this week, I talked in the weekend message about trust, but I want to continue that conversation today by talking about doubt. And that may seem a little opposite. It's not. I ask you 2 questions in the sermon this weekend I think are the 2 most important questions you will ever be asked in your life. The 2 most important questions you'll ever answer in your life. Number 1, do you trust God? And number 2, can God trust you? Now, where you spend eternity is going to be determined by how you answer the first question. Do you trust God? How you live life after you come to Christ, the kind of joy you experience in the Christian life, the adventure you experience in the Christian life, all of that is going to be determined based on how you answer the second question. Can God trust you? I want to stay with those 2 questions today, but I want to focus on the doubt side more than the trust side. And I want to talk about the place of doubt in learning to trust. I think we've got it all wrong. We think that real trust in God is the absence of doubt. And that's not true. In reality, trusting God is obeying Him in the face of our doubts. All of us have doubts at one level or another, every one of us. And I think that's why we need to turn to Abraham. He is Father Abraham, the father of the faith. But he shows us that doubt is a part of our journey to trust God more deeply. And we see doubt in Abraham's life. But the bigger question for me in this whole thing is, when the man we call the father of the faith expresses doubts to God, how does God respond to Abraham's doubts? And I think you're going to fall in love with God more when you see this. Look with me in Genesis chapter 15, and I want you to listen to this conversation between Abraham. We're studying these narratives about Abraham's life in the Bible, learning from them. Here's one of them, Genesis 15, verse number 1. Sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abraham. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but the fact that it says sometime later means we're picking up in a story that is already in process. So in order to fully understand what's going on in Genesis 15, we need to get a glimpse of what happened in chapter 14. We're going to do that in just a moment. But sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you and your reward will be great." But Abraham replied, "O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son?" That's a doubt. "Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir." Verse 4, "Then the Lord said to Abram, 'No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir.' Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, 'Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have.' And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith." Verse 7, "Then he told him, 'I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession.'" Listen to this, another doubt, verse 8. "But Abraham replied, 'O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it?' The Lord told him, 'Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon.' So Abraham presented all these to him, and he killed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle, laid the halves side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half." Notice, God didn't rebuke Abraham. He didn't cut him off. He didn't say, "You sorry piece of low-down dust, after all I've done to you and I've shown myself to you, you're going to sit here and question me?" That's not how God responds. You have this incredible picture of grace. It's almost as if the Father puts his arm around his son who has fallen down and he says, "Get back up. Let's go outside. Abraham, look at the stars. Can you count them? No, you can't. Your descendants are going to number the stars even that you can't count." God was gracious and compassionate in the face of Abraham's doubt and reminds him of the promise. He reaffirms the promise and says, "Abraham, I keep my word." And the Father's going to respond to your doubt in the same way. Now, notice the next verse, verse 6. You know that this moment impacted Abraham deeply because you see in the next verse, in verse number 6, "And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith." So we know Abraham believed the Lord, so we know this compassionate moment of grace in the face of doubt impacted Abraham. And Abraham all of a sudden believed, more so. Belief was stirred up in his heart. God affirmed that belief and credited him as a righteous man because of his faith. So in that same moment, God addressed a measure of Abraham's doubt. Now, you would think that's the end of the story, okay? Abraham doubted, God proves himself, Abraham is affirmed as being righteous because of his great faith. End of story. No, because Abraham's faith is as fickle as ours. In verse 7, God continues the promise to Abraham and said, "Not only am I going to give you that son, but I'm going to give you a land. The land that you're in right now, it's going to be your home. Right now, you're just a foreigner, but this land is going to be your home." And he extends the promise to include not just a nation, a son, but the land itself. And on the heels of that promise, Abraham doubts again. Right after he's been affirmed as righteous because of his faith, he doubts again. Listen to this, verse 8. But Abraham replied, O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it? That's the cry of a doubting heart. How can I know? How can I be sure? I mean, this moment reminds me a lot of the doubting Thomas incident that you have in the New Testament, where Jesus reveals himself to the disciples and Thomas wasn't there, and they try to tell Thomas about it. And Thomas says, I won't believe it until I see it with my eyes, until I touch his wounds. And Jesus shows up in that moment supernaturally in his resurrected body, shows up, and all this unfolds in John chapter 20. And he says, here, Thomas, look. And he grabbed his hand and he said, touch the wounds in my side. And Thomas exclaimed, oh my Lord and my God. And what I want you to notice is Jesus said to him in John 20, stop doubting and believe. This is what I want you to see. Don't you think if what Thomas was saying was sinful, if Thomas's doubt was sinful, and the question that Thomas was asking was sinful, do you think Jesus would have given him what he asked for if what he was asking for was sinful? No. Jesus would not have granted a sinful prayer request. He showed Thomas what he was asking for. He revealed himself to Thomas. But he didn't leave him in his doubt. He gently rebuked his doubt. So this is what I want you to see. Doubt is never encouraged, but the doubter is always welcome. You understand that? Jesus never pushes you away. Doubt is never encouraged, but the doubter is always welcome. Stop doubting and believe. I'm going to meet you where you are, but stop doubting and believe. Here's what you need to know. Honest and sincere doubt never pushes God away. It invites Him in. Your sincere doubt is a cry for God to show Himself more to you. And in these cases with Abraham and Thomas, and we could talk about John the Baptist when he asked, are you really the one? Or do we look for another? All of these great men of God who they're men of faith, and yet they had very real doubts. And in every case, God didn't ostracize the doubter. He revealed Himself to the doubter and encouraged them to move on in their journey to trust more deeply. He wants us to grow past the doubt, but He's not pushed away from us because of it. I think the church has treated doubt as an evil and a sinful problem, but doubt is a real part. Owning doubt, confessing doubt, asking honest questions are a very real part of growing more deeply in our trust. There's a real problem with the church shunning the hard questions. People walk away from their faith because they don't think there's any answers, because there's no space to ask the questions. And the ones who stay in the faith, but they have questions, they live with guilt because they have these questions. Your questions are not wrong, and God is not running away from you because of your questions. This is part of your journey to learn how to trust more deeply. And there are answers. And God will reveal Himself to you in your sincere doubt. Now zero in on something with me in this Genesis 15 narrative. The two times that Abraham voices his doubt, you see the foundation of doubt in all of our life. Because doubt is a multi-layered thing. All doubt in all of our lives comes in two forms. We first start by questioning God, and then we question ourselves. And you see both of that in both of those layers in Abraham's doubt. When Abraham asked God at the beginning, are you going to keep your word? Are you going to give me a son? In essence, he was saying to God, this was doubting God. Can I trust you? Are you trustworthy? Can you be counted on? Okay, this was doubt of God. But in the second question, when we get down to verse 8, when Abraham is saying, how can I be sure? I'm going to give you land, Abraham. How can I know? How can I be sure that I will possess it? What Abraham is saying, he's doubting himself. I know, God, that you can be my person. But how do I know that you can be my God, but how do I know that I can be your person? We know that Abraham had settled the God issue. When God took him outside and said, look, I promise I'm going to keep my word, Abraham believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So Abraham settled the God question. All the questions you might have about God, that moment had been settled in Abraham's heart. It was credited to him as righteousness. But he had not moved past self-doubt. How can I know that I will possess it? So this is self-doubt. When you settle the God question, is he there? And then is he trustworthy? Then you're going to move on to asking the question, okay, God is good, he's trustworthy. I'm just not really sure I can be the kind of guy or the kind of gal that can live up to what needs to be lived up to in order for God to accomplish what he wants to accomplish through me. How can I know that I will possess it? Abraham's two questions of doubt are the basis of all doubt. What happens next is one of the most beautiful pictures of grace we're going to find anywhere in all the Bible, because God responds to both aspects of Abraham's doubt. When Abraham said, Lord, how can I be sure? I want you to watch what God does. He reveals himself to Abraham. Verse 9, the Lord told him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And so Abraham presented all these to him. Now, it's obvious the way Abraham responds here, he knew exactly what God was doing. God gives no instructions of what to do with all these animals. God doesn't tell Abraham, there's no instruction. The moment God gave the assignment, Abraham starts acting, which means God and Abraham both know what's going on here. You and I don't. We're not privy to what is happening here, but there's a known something here that you and I don't know. And I really think in order to fully grasp the depth of what happens here, we got to dig a little deeper into the culture. Abraham is asked, how can I know? And God said, I'm about to show you. In our culture, this would be a moment we would pull out a piece of paper or stacks of paper and we would sign a contract. Because in a written culture, the way you can be sure somebody is going to keep their promise or keep their obligation to you and to fulfill their promise is to sign a contract. When a salesperson says, you get this much car for this much money, or this much house for this much money, or this much whatever for this much money, we ask them, how can I know? How can I be sure? And then the paper comes out, the attorneys look over it, we all agree to it, we both sign our names into the contractual agreement. This is exactly what God is doing with Abraham in this moment. But their culture was not a written culture. Their culture was an oral culture. And the way you formed a legally binding agreement in their culture was through a covenant. And you acted out the culture, the agreement in an oral culture. You dramatized, ritualized the agreement. And basically what you were saying in this agreement is that the fate of he told Abraham, take these animals, cut them in half, lay them on the side, and basically what you were saying is, if I don't keep my end of the agreement, may my consequence for not meeting my promise or fulfilling my obligation be the same as these animals. May I be cut off. Now, we know from history and archaeology, this was a reoccurring way that legally binding agreements were made in ancient Near Eastern cultures. Animals were cut in half, they were aligned in 2 rows, and both parties who were entering into the agreement would walk between the pieces. They would walk between both halves of the animal. In essence, that was the way of signing their name to the contract and agreeing to the consequences. If I don't fulfill my promise or my obligation of this legally binding agreement, may my fate be the fate of these animals. If I don't keep my word, may I be cut off. You actually see a reference to this in another place in the Bible. Jeremiah 34:18, Jeremiah the prophet, there's a whole context to this, and I'm not going to go into it, I just want you to see. In Jeremiah 34:18, Jeremiah says, because you've broken the terms of our contract, I will cut you apart just as you cut apart the calf when you walk between its halves to solemnize your vows. This is a known way to bind legally agreements. In other words, we're making agreement because you didn't keep your agreement, Jeremiah said, may the fate of the calf be your calf. You didn't fulfill your contractual obligations. This is exactly what is going on in Genesis 15. And God is addressing Abraham's doubts in the form of a covenant. Watch this, verse 17. After the sun went down and darkness fell, Abraham saw a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch pass between the halves or the pieces of the carcasses. So the Lord made a covenant with Abraham that day and said, I have given this land to your descendants all the way to the border of Egypt. Now the reference to the smoking fire pot and the flaming torch in Hebrew are the same exact words for fire and smoke that fell on Mount Sinai when Moses was receiving the 10 Commandments. It's the same exact Hebrew words used for the pillar of fire and the cloud that led the children of Israel through the wilderness. So this is an undeniable, an unmistakable reference to the presence of God. God came and walked between the pieces. Now, this is remarkable on several fronts. One, because when we look at history, and when we know this is a Near Eastern way of binding agreements in the ancient world, kings and authority figures rarely did they walk between the pieces. It was a one-sided covenant from the vassal or the servant would obligate themselves to the king. So they would sacrifice an animal, cut it in half. They would walk between the pieces, vowing their allegiance to that king. Rarely ever did a king or an authority figure stoop down and the king walk through between the pieces. On rare occasions, we know of some rare occasions, when you had a very good and a gracious king who was making the same level of commitment to his people that his people were making to him, he would come off the throne, walk in between the pieces, and it was a dual commitment. But never, ever in history do we have a situation where an authority figure walks between the pieces and the vassal or the servant doesn't. But I want you to pay attention. After the smoking firepot and the flame, after they pass through, God passes through the pieces. Verse 18 says this, it's now Abraham's turn. Abraham is supposed to sign his part of the contract. But verse 18 says, God goes through. Verse 18 says, so the Lord made a covenant with Abraham that day. Wait, time out. I mean, Abraham didn't sign his name. Abraham didn't walk through. He didn't get his turn. Do you realize what is happening here? And you have to understand, anytime God steps into a human cultural form, He changes it. When Jesus stepped into human flesh, He changed it. And God stepped into this ancient Near Eastern form of legally binding agreements. Anytime God steps into a human form, He changes it. And He changes this. Nowhere in history does this ever happen where the authority figure signs the contract and does not allow the servant to sign the contract. But in doing it this way, what God is doing is answering both questions Abraham asked. He's answering both layers of his doubt. He is affirming Abraham's ability to trust in God, and he is saying to Abraham, he is addressing Abraham's self-doubt. He's saying to Abraham, by finalizing the covenant without Abraham signing the contract, he's saying, Abraham, my faithfulness is greater than your failure. My promise to do this is greater than your doubts. My grace is greater than your sin. Your future and the promise I'm giving you is not contingent on your weaknesses. It's not going to be voided by your weaknesses. It's going to be upheld by my strength. So I'm going to walk through the piece to tell you, if I fail, I'll pay the penalty. And I'm not going to let you sign because I want you to know if you fail, I will bear the consequence of your failure. I will take the weight of your failure. And I'm even going to use your failure to still accomplish my purposes. I'm making you a promise, Abraham, that is not contingent on you. I'm making you a promise that is entirely contingent upon me. So in that sense, this is this most incredible picture of grace in all of the Bible. And God is saying to you, just like He's saying to Abraham, I want to come into covenant with you. And I don't know if your head's going anywhere, but it ought to be foreshadowing something to you, because there's probably some of you in your own doubts that were saying, oh, if God would just come down to me like He did to Abraham and cut a covenant with me like that to address all of my doubts. Oh, but He did. 2,000 years ago, when Jesus was led like a lamb to the slaughter, the lamb was cut off from God, forsaken. My God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus said. He was cut off so that it was the same moment we have on the cross is the moment that God had with Abraham that day in Genesis 15. He has cut Himself off and walked in between the pieces, and He signed the contract for him, and He signed the contract for you. And He says, if you fail, you will fail. But just know I'm going to pay the penalty. I'm going to make myself accountable to pay for your failure. You're going to break covenant, and I'm going to pay for the consequences. I'm going to sign my name because I don't break covenant. And I'm going to sign my name where you should because you can't keep covenant. And I want you to know my grace is greater than your failure to keep the covenant. I don't know how you can't trust a God like that. A God that loves you like that. And here's what I would say. What if Abraham had never expressed his doubts? If Abraham had been in the church in the 21st century where doubts are not welcome, he would have just sat in the row in church and felt guilty for having the questions. But because there was an intimacy with God, he just said, how can I know? How can I know you're good? And God comes down in this most beautiful picture of grace, and he walks between the pieces. Listen, courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing it even when you're afraid. Do you think men and women who run into battle in the face of gunfire are not afraid? Yes. But they're courageous because they're willing to do it even though they're afraid. There is a cause greater than the fear on the inside of them. That's bravery. In much the same way, trust is not the absence of doubt. It's walking in obedience to God even when all of the answers aren't clear and even when it looks impossible. I have questions. I probably have more questions than I have answers. And I'm going to keep trusting. And I'm just going to tell you, this moment with Abraham, this narrative in Genesis 15, has so much to say to where you and your family are right now. It has so much to say to where Northplace is, trying to do more for the kingdom than we've ever done in our lives. We're fighting the enemy left and right because we're taking territory for the kingdom. I don't have all the answers, but I know I'm doing what God asked me to do. He said go, and we're going, and I can't tell you the end result. I just know we're going to trust Him. And I just want to tell you, I don't want to oversell and underdeliver anything. I just have this sense that as we walk through this journey, culminating in that arena at the Curtis Colwell Center on November the 10th, it's going to be this amazing moment where God promises something to us and we sense His presence and a powerful moment of surrender. I just want to pray for you. I do. I want to pray for you. I know you're going to walk into some discussion time, and I just want to ask God to use this word to take your doubts and lead you to a place of deeper trust. Father, I know where the Jarrett family is. I know where Northplace Church is, and I don't even act like I know where every person listening to this is, but God, would you help us sense the love of God in this moment for us, that you signed your name where I was supposed to sign mine because you knew we're covenant breakers by nature, but you are a covenant keeper. That you've been more faithful to me than I've been faithful to you, and the things that are in my heart that you want to do, my failures and my weaknesses don't void the promises because you signed your name where I'm supposed to sign mine. And God, I get so much rest and comfort in that. And it just makes me want to re-up today and reaffirm I'm going to obey you. Just all you got to do is speak and I'll obey. With my life, my resources, I'll be your currency. Lord, spend me. And I pray that's the heart of every person listening to this. Will you bless the discussion and prayer time in these groups today? In Jesus' name, amen. I love you. See you next week.